Right now, there's a good chance something in your fridge is legally not allowed to be called cheese, and the FDA said so in writing. Not a lower grade. Not an inferior version. Not cheese, period. The U.S. cheese market moves over $20 billion a year, and a real chunk of what's sold under that name doesn't meet the federal government's own definition of it. 5 brands that fail that test. 5 that pass. Let's start with the worst. Here's exactly what we're checking every brand against. 4 things, and every one of them is right there on the package. First, ingredient count. Real cheese needs 4 things: milk, cultures, salt, and enzymes. Anything beyond that is usually a filler or an emulsifier doing the cheese's job for it. Second, FDA classification. Does the package actually say cheese? Or does it say prepared cheese product? That single phrase is the legal tell that the product doesn't meet the federal standard of identity. Third, sourcing. Farmer-owned cooperative or industrial commodity supply chain with no name attached to where the milk actually came from. And fourth, what happens when it melts. Real cheddar pulls and stretches. Processed cheese products liquefy into a puddle or clump into something rubbery, because that's chemistry, not cheese. For checks, keep them in mind because every brand on this list gets measured against all 4. Number 5. Great Value Shredded Cheddar. Walmart's house brand, and by sheer volume, this is probably one of the most purchased cheese products in the entire country. It's in millions of carts every week without a second thought. A 16-ounce bag runs somewhere around $3.50, and on paper, that looks like a genuine win for the grocery budget. Cheap, familiar, sitting right there in the dairy case at every Walmart in America. But flip the bag over and actually read what's in it, and the story changes. Several Great Value shredded varieties use artificial coloring to hit that classic bright cheddar orange look people expect. That's worth sitting with for a second. The color you're seeing isn't the natural result of the milk and the aging process. It's a dye job, engineered to match an expectation rather than reflect what's actually happening inside the bag. Then there's the ingredient that matters even more. Powdered cellulose, listed plainly as an anti-caking agent. Cellulose is derived from wood pulp. It's the same category of material used in things like paper products, not food. In this context, it has 0 nutritional value. It's not there to preserve anything, and it's not doing anything for flavor. Its entire job is to keep the shreds from clumping together in the bag. And in the process, it adds bulk. Every ounce of cellulose sitting in that bag is an ounce of actual cheese you didn't get for your money. You're not just buying cheese with a filler in it, you're buying diluted cheese priced and packaged like the real thing. Here's a simple way to notice it yourself. Open a bag and take a real sniff before you use it. That faint, slightly stale, almost cardboard-like undertone that most people just write off as store-brand smell. That's not your imagination. That's the cellulose. It has its own scent profile, and once you know what you're smelling for, you can't unsmell it. At roughly 22 cents an ounce, this is genuinely one of the cheapest cheese products on the shelf. But cheap stops being the win it looks like the moment a wood pulp derivative becomes a featured ingredient rather than a footnote. You're not choosing between expensive cheese and affordable cheese here. You're choosing between real cheese and cheese that's been stretched with something that isn't cheese at all. Number 4. Sargento. Family-owned in Wisconsin since 1953, and the packaging leans hard into that heritage. Natural cheese, no fillers, generations of American dairy tradition front and center. For some of their sliced products, that image genuinely holds up reasonably well. But look closer at the shredded line, and the picture shifts. Several Sargento shredded varieties use natamycin, a mold inhibitor that several health-focused retailers restrict or avoid stocking altogether. Part of why you won't find certain Sargento products on those particular shelves. Natamycin isn't dangerous in a single serving, but some research has raised questions about repeated, regular exposure rather than the occasional surface treatment it was originally designed for, which is part of why more cautious retailers keep their distance from it. There's also a legal thread worth knowing about here. Sargento has faced legal challenges from consumer advocacy groups alleging its antibiotic-free labeling didn't match what was actually happening in its milk supply. Worth confirming the current status of that case before this airs. Legal challenges like this can settle, get dismissed, or remain open for years, and the claim needs to reflect exactly where things stand now, not just where they started. Separate from the lawsuit, some independent environmental research groups have raised concerns about contaminant levels in dairy products generally, including flags on Sargento specifically, again worth pulling the actual published data directly rather than relying on a secondhand summary before that goes into a script. Texturally, this is where the natamycin shows its hand. Sargento shredded cheddar tends to melt into greasy, uneven clumps rather than the smooth, even pull you'd get from cleaner cheddar, a mold inhibitor interfering with the natural protein structure of the cheese as it heats. At around $5 for 8 ounces, you're paying a mid-tier price for a heavily managed industrial dairy product wrapped in genuinely appealing heritage branding. To be fair to Sargento, there is real cheese in what they're selling, which is more than we can say for some of what's still ahead on this list. Number 3. Borden. One of America's oldest dairy names, founded in 1857, that's roughly 170 years of brand history riding on a single mascot. Elsie the cow has represented Borden since 1936, flower crown and all, and there's genuinely nothing that says wholesome American dairy, quite like a cartoon cow with a name and a face. That's the entire point of the branding. Nostalgia doing the heavy lifting so nobody looks too closely at what's actually in the package. Here's what's actually in the package. Borden makes a line of processed and prepared cheese products built to be shelf-stable and affordable, and to hit both of those targets, the ingredient list leans heavily on anti-caking agents and mold inhibitors. These aren't incidental trace additives tucked in at the bottom of the label. They're structural to what Borden is actually selling. The product doesn't work texturally or logistically without them. And Borden isn't even hiding it, not really. Certain Borden items are labeled directly on the packaging as pasteurized prepared cheese product, the exact same FDA category we flagged with Velveeta and Kraft Singles. Under federal standard of identity rules, that specific phrase is the legal admission that the product doesn't qualify as cheese. It's printed right there, in plain language, for anyone who bothers to read past the logo. Borden is using a 170-year-old name and a cartoon cow to sell something that, by the FDA's own definition, legally cannot be called cheese. The texture confirms it before you even get to the label. Borden's processed slices are rubbery and waxy. They bend instead of snap, and they pull apart in sheets rather than crumbling the way real cheddar does. Actual cheese has structure. This has the give of a rubber gasket. At the price point Borden sits at, you're not paying for heritage dairy craftsmanship. You're paying for shelf stability and a familiar name, and the ingredient list tells you exactly where those priorities landed. Number 2. Kraft Singles. America's go-to since 1950, the foundation of 1,000 diner cheeseburgers, sitting in nearly every American refrigerator at some point, and also one of the most legally scrutinized processed dairy products the FDA has ever taken action on. Here's the reason it's called Kraft Singles and not Kraft cheese. By regulation, the product contains less than 51% actual cheese curds. That's not an opinion or a marketing spin. It's the direct, legal reason the word cheese cannot appear as a standalone product name on the packaging. What you're buying is officially classified as a pasteurized prepared cheese product, a category the FDA created specifically because the product doesn't meet the standard of identity required to be called cheese outright. In 2002, that classification came under formal scrutiny. The FDA sent Kraft a warning letter over how Singles and Velveeta were being labeled, arguing the products didn't conform to the food category they were being marketed under. Kraft's response is worth sitting with. Before that warning letter even arrived, the company had already announced it would reclassify Singles from pasteurized processed cheese food to pasteurized prepared cheese product, a category with no standard of identity and no approved ingredient list at all. They didn't reformulate the product to meet the cheese standard. They moved it into a regulatory category with essentially no rules to meet in the first place. Then there's the recall history. The exact case counts here need to be pulled directly from the FDA and USDA recall databases before this airs. Packaging-related recalls tied to plastic wrapper fragments adhering to the cheese slice have happened more than once over the years, and the precise scope, dates, and case numbers for each incident should be verified rather than estimated, since a specific figure that turns out to be wrong is the fastest way to undercut an otherwise solid claim. What's safe to say without a specific number? This is a product that has dealt with the same packaging defect, thin strips of wrapper sticking to the slice, creating a potential choking hazard, more than once, across multiple separate recall actions spanning years, not a single isolated incident. There's also the ingredient question underneath the cheese question. Sodium phosphate is the emulsifier responsible for that uniform, plastic-smooth melt singles are known for, and it's a compound that shows up in nephrology research literature in connection with arterial calcification and added kidney strain when consumed regularly over time. That's worth stating carefully and precisely, sourced to the actual research rather than summarized loosely, since it's a health claim that needs to hold up to real scrutiny. Texturally, this is chemistry doing cheese's job. A Kraft single slides off a hot burger in one uniform rubbery sheet and leaves a faint greasy film behind. Not the uneven melt and pull you'd get from actual cheddar, but the predictable, engineered behavior of an emulsified product built for consistency over character. At roughly $5 for 16 slices, you're paying close to real cheese pricing for a product whose own manufacturer had to legally stop calling it cheese, in writing, in response to a federal warning letter. Number 1. Velveeta. And this is the clearest, most airtight case on the entire list, because unlike everything we've covered so far, this one isn't a matter of interpretation or a lawsuit still working its way through court. This is a direct finding from the Food and Drug Administration itself in writing over 2 decades ago, and it has never been reversed. Velveeta was invented back in 1918, originally as a way to salvage broken cheese wheels that would otherwise go to waste. A genuinely practical, cheese-adjacent origin story. But the modern formulation is a completely different product. Today's Velveeta starts with milk and whey rather than aged cheese, and builds its structure around milk protein concentrate, canola oil, and modified food starch. Those aren't trace additives sitting at the bottom of an ingredient list. They're the core of what the product actually is. In 2002, the FDA sent Kraft a formal warning letter specifically demanding that the phrase cheese spread be removed from Velveeta's packaging. The agency's position was direct. The product did not conform to the legal standard of identity required to carry that label. As a result, Velveeta was reclassified as a pasteurized prepared cheese product, a category that, critically, has no standard of identity and no approved ingredient list at all. That's not a loophole Velveeta slipped through quietly. It's a regulatory category that exists specifically for products that don't qualify as anything more defined. And that classification has held unchanged for more than 20 years. The formulation hasn't meaningfully shifted since. Look at the actual ingredient list and the scale of what's in there becomes clear. Milk protein concentrate, modified food starch, sodium phosphate, sodium alginate, sodium citrate, sorbic acid, lactic acid, 2 separate synthetic colorants. That's over 15 individual ingredients working together to simulate what 4 ingredients, milk, cultures, salt, and enzymes, accomplish naturally in real cheddar. Sodium phosphate, sodium alginate, and sodium citrate are all emulsifying salts, and their entire job is breaking down natural protein structures to force that smooth, homogeneous gel texture Velveeta is known for. Sorbic acid handles mold prevention. The synthetic colorants supply that unmistakable orange. The sodium numbers are where this really separates itself from everything else on the list. Velveeta runs at roughly 410 milligrams of sodium per 1 ounce serving. Real cheddar averages around 175 milligrams per ounce for comparison, meaning Velveeta carries more than double the sodium, ounce for ounce, of the cheese it's standing in for. Use a full cup in a recipe, which plenty of queso and mac and cheese recipes call for, and you've already loaded over 3,000 milligrams of sodium into the dish before adding a single other ingredient. The American Heart Association's recommended daily sodium maximum sits at 2,300 milligrams total. 1 cup of Velveeta alone can blow past that on its own. And then there's what happens when you actually melt it. Real cheddar, when heated properly, pulls and stretches. That's protein structure doing what protein structure does. Velveeta melts into a smooth, neon orange, completely homogeneous liquid with 0 pull and 0 resistance. Nothing resembling the behavior of actual cheese. At around $9 for a 32-ounce block, you're paying for canola oil, modified starch, and a stack of emulsifying salts, wrapped in a thin layer of dairy credibility. From a product that has been legally barred from calling itself cheese for more than 20 years, and shows no sign of that ever changing. Before we get to the brands that actually pass, there's a pattern worth naming clearly, because it's the single most useful thing in this entire video. It's not really about which brand feels more trustworthy, or which one has the nicer packaging, or which one leans harder into heritage marketing. Comes down to one simple habit. Check the actual product name printed on the package, not just the brand name above it. Here's why that matters so much. Under FDA rules, there isn't just one category called cheese. There are at least 4 distinct legal classifications sitting right next to each other on grocery shelves: cheese, cheese food, cheese spread, and cheese product. And each one carries a different, specific legal meaning about what's actually allowed to be inside. Cheese has to meet a genuine standard of identity. Cheese food and cheese spread allow certain additional ingredients but still have defined limits. And cheese product, the category Velveeta and so many processed slices fall into, has no standard of identity at all. No required minimum cheese content. No approved ingredient list. It's the regulatory equivalent of an empty box that a company can fill with almost anything, as long as they don't call it cheese outright. For words, for completely different legal realities. And most shoppers walk past all of them without ever reading past the brand name in bold letters at the top. That's the whole game, and once you know to look for it, you'll never read a cheese label the same way again. Number 5. Organic Valley. Organic Valley is a farmer-owned cooperative founded in Wisconsin back in 1988, and it's operated on the same founding principle ever since. The farmers set the standards, not a corporate boardroom sitting somewhere far from an actual dairy farm. Their cheddar is made with exactly 4 ingredients: pasteurized milk, cheese cultures, salt, and enzymes. No milk protein concentrate, no modified food starch, no emulsifying salts, no cellulose filler padding the weight. For ingredients, and that's genuinely the complete list, nothing hidden further down the label. The brand carries USDA certified organic status and is non-GMO project verified, which means the cows behind this cheese aren't treated with synthetic hormones or routine preventive antibiotics. A direct contrast to some of the sourcing questions raised earlier on this list. Per 1 ounce serving, you're looking at approximately 7 grams of protein, 200 milligrams of sodium, and 0 added sugar, and every gram of that protein is coming from real dairy, not from milk protein concentrate doing the heavy lifting on a nutrition label. The flavor reflects that clean ingredient list directly. Mild, clean. A slight natural tang with a soft milky sweetness that's simply absent from anything on the skip list. No chemical aftertaste. No waxy residue left behind on your palate. At around $6 to $7 for an 8-ounce block, it costs more than Great Value or Kraft Singles. But at that point, the comparison isn't really fair to begin with because this time you're actually buying cheese. Number 4. Beecher's Handmade Cheese. This one started in 2003 inside Pike Place Market in Seattle, and the entire operation was built around a simple, almost radical idea. Make the cheese in full view of the people buying it. Glass walls, an open production floor, nothing hidden from the customer standing on the other side of the window. That transparency wasn't a marketing gimmick bolted on after the fact. It was the founding philosophy of the company from day one. Beecher's flagship cheddar carries the exact same clean ingredient list we've been using as the standard throughout this entire video. Pasteurized milk, salt, culture, and enzymes. That's the complete list. No anti-caking agents. No powdered cellulose. No natamycin. No mold inhibitors of any kind interfering with how the protein structure develops as the cheese ages. Compare that to the 15+ ingredients sitting in a block of Velveeta, and you start to see just how much of what's on grocery shelves is solving problems that simply don't exist when you start with real milk and let real aging do the work. In blind taste testing conducted by independent food publications, Beecher's flagship competed for the top spot among all grocery store cheddars evaluated, and specifically stood out for delivering the best mouthfeel of any cheese in that comparison. A side-by-side panel result, not something pulled from the company's own marketing copy. That distinction matters because mouthfeel is exactly the thing that's hardest to fake with additives. It's the direct result of how the proteins and fats actually develop during aging, not something an emulsifying salt can replicate. Nutritionally, per 1 ounce serving, you're looking at around 7 grams of protein and approximately 170 milligrams of sodium, notably lower than several of the mainstream, heavily processed brands we've already covered, and with 0 fillers contributing empty weight or artificial bulk to the block. The flavor itself is deeply savory, slightly nutty, and genuinely complex in a way that the big box cheese aisle simply doesn't replicate at scale. That complexity is what real aging does to milk over time. Sodium phosphate and modified food starch can imitate a texture, but they can't imitate that. At roughly $8 to $9 for a small block, this is a real premium over something like Great Value or Kraft Singles. But unlike those brands, you're actually getting something for that price difference, an entire block of genuine, traceable cheese made by people you could watch make it, rather than a product engineered in a lab to survive a shelf and a squeeze bottle. Number 3. Tillamook. This is a farmer-owned cooperative out of the Oregon coast, founded all the way back in 1909, and still owned by that same cooperative of local dairy farmers more than a century later. No venture capital sitting on the board. No multinational food conglomerate making cost-cutting calls from a corporate office somewhere far from the farms actually producing the milk. Just the same structure it started with, farmers who make the cheese deciding how the cheese gets made. Tillamook's medium white cheddar contains milk, salt, and enzymes. That's the complete list. And there's a specific detail worth sitting with here, because it's a direct, visible contrast to almost everything we've covered so far on this list. No artificial coloring anywhere. What you're looking at in a block of Tillamook cheddar is the actual natural color of the milk it came from, not a dye job engineered to hit a specific shade of orange that consumers have been trained to associate with cheddar. Great Value and Kraft Singles both lean on synthetic colorants to manufacture that look. Tillamook simply doesn't need to, because there's nothing being disguised or standardized here. Per 1 ounce serving, you're looking at roughly 7 grams of protein, about 200 milligrams of sodium, 0 added sugar, and around 15% of your daily recommended calcium intake. Numbers that hold up cleanly against anything on the good list and blow past anything on the bad one. It's described as bold, smooth, and naturally aged. And it's picked up genuine industry recognition over the years for exactly that. When it melts, it behaves the way cheddar is actually supposed to behave. Clean, proper pulls with real stretch, because there are no emulsifying salts in the mix fighting against the natural dairy proteins trying to do their job. This is what melted cheddar looks like when nothing is interfering with the process. At around $6 for a 16-ounce block, Tillamook is arguably the most accessible entry on this entire good list. Genuinely competitive with what you'd pay for the worst offenders on the bad side, while delivering a clean, farmer-owned, naturally colored cheddar with real credentials behind it. It's the clearest evidence on this whole list that paying more isn't actually the requirement here. The requirement is just buying from a brand that isn't cutting corners to begin with. Number 2. Kerrygold. This is an Irish dairy cooperative operating on a principle that most of the American mass-market dairy industry simply doesn't prioritize. Let the cows graze on actual grass for as much of the year as the climate allows, and get out of the way of what that produces naturally. Kerrygold sources exclusively from grass-fed cows, and none of them are treated with synthetic growth hormones. That distinction matters more than it might sound like on the surface. Grass-fed dairy is consistently associated in nutritional research with higher concentrations of omega-3 fatty acids and conjugated linoleic acid, commonly known as CLA, compared to milk from conventionally raised, grain-fed dairy cows. It's worth being precise about what that claim actually is and isn't. This isn't a proprietary Kerrygold discovery or a marketing invention specific to this brand. It's a well-documented property of grass-fed dairy generally, rooted in basic ruminant biology. What a cow eats over the course of its life shows up in the composition of its milk. Kerrygold isn't claiming to have engineered something unique. It's simply sourcing from a farming model that produces this result as a natural consequence, and then not doing anything afterward to interfere with it. The cheddar itself keeps to the same 4-ingredient standard we've been holding every brand to throughout this list. Pasteurized milk, salt, cheese cultures, and enzymes. Nothing else. The reserve variety, aged for 2 years, delivers a bold, complex flavor profile that's earned recognition in blind tasting evaluations, specifically called out as one of the standout options for a cheese board in independent panel testing, not just brand messaging. Per 1 ounce serving, Kerrygold delivers around 7 grams of protein and roughly 200 milligrams of sodium, with 0 added sugar. The fat content runs slightly higher than many domestic cheddars, and that's a direct reflection of the richer, grass-fed milk it's made from rather than a commodity dairy blend assembled from mixed sources. Flavor-wise, expect salty crystalline pockets scattered throughout the cheese, a natural result of extended aging, alongside a delicately sweet, nutty character and a finish some tasters describe as faintly tropical. That kind of layered complexity comes from clean milk and real aging time. There's no factory shortcut, no emulsifying process that can replicate it artificially. At roughly $6 to $7 for a 7-ounce block, you're paying a bit more per ounce than some of the more accessible options on this list. But what you're actually buying is 2 full years of aging, built on a dairy tradition with no interest in shortcuts, grass, time, and nothing else doing the work. Number 1. Cabot Creamery. And this is the brand that closes the list on exactly the right note, because everything Velveeta wasn't, Cabot is. Cabot is a farmer-owned cooperative based in Vermont, founded in 1919, and it's still owned entirely by roughly 1,000 New England dairy farm families to this day. That's not a marketing detail tucked into an Our Story page. It's the actual governance structure. There's no corporate parent making cost-cutting decisions from a boardroom somewhere else in the country. No private equity firm optimizing margins between farmers and shelf price. The people who own the cows, milk them, and bring that milk to the creamery are the same people voting on how the business is run. When a brand's entire structure runs through the farms themselves rather than around them, the incentive to cut corners looks completely different than it does for a publicly traded conglomerate managing a national commodity supply chain. And that structure shows up directly in what's actually in the cheese. Cabot Cheddar is made with 4 ingredients: milk, cheese cultures, salt, and enzymes. That's the complete list, full stop. No milk protein concentrate standing in for real dairy, no modified food starch doing structural work, no emulsifying salts forcing a texture that aging should be creating naturally, and no synthetic dyes manufacturing that orange color for you. 0 added sugar. Every gram of protein is coming directly from real milk, not from a protein concentrate padding out a nutrition label to look better than the product actually is. Cabot's texture is crumbly and firm, built from actual calcium lactate crystals forming naturally through enzymatic activity during proper aging. So here's where this actually lands. The difference between the two lists was never really about price. Several of these brands, good and bad, sit within $1 or $2 of each other. It wasn't about packaging either. Came down to 2 things: for ingredients versus 15, and a word on the label that's either legally cheese or legally something else entirely, whether the front of the package admits it or not. Now you know which is which. Next time you're standing in that dairy aisle, flip the package over before it goes in the cart. The answer's already printed right there, it's just never the part anyone reads. If this saved you from grabbing the wrong block tonight, a like helps other shoppers find it too. And subscribing means you won't miss the next grocery gumshoe investigation. Shop smarter. Waste less. Save more. See you in the next one.